We're holding at the bracha of Lamalshim al Tisikvo. Initially, when the men of the High Assembly had authored the Shmon Esrei, and as I mentioned in the introduction, that Rambam writes that the language of God is Hebrew. Hebrew is called the Holy Tongue. And after the Babylonian exile, when the Jews came back from Babylon, their Hebrew was a jargon. Before they left, the Hebrew was a pure Hebrew because we were never in exile. When we came back from Babylon, it was a combination of Babylonian and Persian. And because it was not the pure language any longer, therefore, the men of the High Assembly, Anshe Knesset Gedolah, they authored a uniform format and text that every Jew who prays, who says the Amidah, it's the identical text. And the words themselves have unlimited depth and breadth. So whatever you insert in them in terms of within the understanding of those words or those statements, it has its value, but it's written in the purest Hebrew. So initially, this blessing of Olam Moshinim was not one of those blessings. We refer to the Amidah Shmona Esrei, 18 blessings, although they're 19 blessings. And why were there 18? Initially, there were only 18. They added a 19th later because there were issues. There were issues with informers, with heretics, which were causing very serious problems to the Jewish people. For instance, the Gemara tells us that during the Second Temple period, there were more than 300 high priests. During the First Temple period, the only difference between the First Temple period and Second Temple period was 10-year difference. First Temple period stood 410 years. The Second Temple period stood 420 years. In the First Temple period, 410 years, the high priests that spanned all those years were only, it's a question, 13 priests, 13 high priests. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the only day of the year. The Second Temple period, over 300 high priests were appointed to be a high priest. Why was it so short-lived? So the Gemara tells us that if a person was not qualified to go into the Holy of Holies because of the overwhelming intensity of Kedusha, of holiness, he would die there. He would expire. So therefore, continuously, they have to appoint new high priests. And of those 420 years, Shimon HaTzadik, who was, as it's mentioned in Pirkei Avos, was from the remnant of the High Assembly, he officiated for 40 years. So you can imagine what was going on over there in terms of the caliber, the spiritual caliber, every one of these people, that he did not survive the Holy of Holies. During that, so he was part of that High Assembly, Shimon HaTzadik, who authored the original 18 blessings. There were only Shmona Esrei, that's why it's called Shmona Esrei, the 18. And then, because of issues which happened later, they had to add a 19th blessing. What was the issues? In the time of Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Pious, there were a certain sect of Jews. They were called Tzdukim, Sadducees. The Sadducees, they themselves believed that the only authentic divine script is the written law. The interpretation of the written law, which we call the oral law, is not divine. It's something which the rabbis made up themselves. Was not communicated by God, although the rabbis tell you that it is God's interpretation. They rejected it totally, and they said the Torah is open to anyone's interpretation. As long as it fits the words, that's what God says, it's okay. The only thing God says, you're limited to the words. But as long as those words could contain whatever conceivable interpretation you have, that is doing the will of God. That was their position. And there was tremendous strife between the Pharisees, those were the ones, the rabbis, who were the carriers of the tradition, not only the written, but even the oral law, and the Sadducees were opposed. And Sadducees did whatever they can, even to put the Jewish people into jeopardy. And they would go to the government and inform on the rabbis, even to the point where their lives, and endless numbers of Jews' lives were in jeopardy. For instance, in the time of Alexander the Great, who's known in the Talmud as Alexander the Macedonian. In Hebrew, it's called Alexander Mugdon, but in English, it's called Macedonian. Macedonia was part of Greece, and he conquered the world supreme. He was a young man, conquered the world. And he was a man who was a super genius. Life meant nothing to him. He was a ruthless murderer. And he set up a world court. And I mentioned a few weeks ago where the Egyptians had come to him and they lodged a complaint against the Jewish people in the world court that the Jewish people were a bunch of thieves. What did they do? That before they left Egypt, they borrowed the personal effects, the gold and silver vessels of the Egyptians. And they said when they requested, it was only on loan. And they left Egypt without coming back. So all that wealth that they actually depleted Egypt, that wealth is still owed to us because they stole it from us, making us believe it was on loan, but it was for keeps. So therefore, they're coming with a claim that the number that's owed to them is something which is so beyond reality in terms of being able to contend with that number. If the Jews would be forced to pay it, it would bankrupt the Jewish people. They couldn't afford to carry that kind of debt, to pay that. And Alexander heard it very well. It says in the Bible, the Jews borrowed the silver and gold vessels and other things, and they said, borrow, and they did not return. So they didn't know what to do. So there was a man who was a hunchback, and he goes to the Sanhedrin, that's the High Court of Israel. He says, let me go address this issue. I think I could somehow resolve it, and we're going to come out, we'll be vindicated in court. So he said to them, if I win the case, I've won the case. And if I lose the case, they'll say he was a misfit. Therefore, he wasn't a proper representation of the Jewish people. So then you'll send the so-called, the people who are really expert in this area to present it as it should be presented. He goes to the court and he says to them, if you read the Bible, they enslaved an innocent people for 400 years. 400 years we're in Egypt. And every birth was 6 children. Like rodents, we proliferated. So if you do the numbers, 400 years with tens and tens of millions of people, innocent people being enslaved without payment. Not only did they not give payment, they tortured and they killed them. What is the Egyptian debt to the Jewish people? What we took out of Egypt was a pittance in terms of what was owed to us. The only way we could be compensated to any degree, we had to dupe them and make a request as a loan, but in fact, it was payback time. That's what we said to borrow. But is there a balance? The balance is not to be believed what that balance is. When the Egyptians heard this, it says they fled court. They ran away. And all their orchards and fields that were filled with produce, they abandoned, and the Jews took over those fields and all those vineyards. That was the story. Alexander being the so-called the arbiter of the world, and he's the one who will adjudicate every issue. He's the head of the world court because he conquered the world supreme. So Mara tells us that the Sadducees went to Alexander the Great. The only location he did not conquer yet was Yerushalayim and the temple. That was his last conquest before he conquered the whole world. And the Sadducees go to him. They say to Alexander, you know what those Jews do in that temple? They pray every day for your destruction. That you should lose every war and you should be killed. Could you imagine the man himself, although he was a genius and he was a strategist of one of a kind in war, but he was a megalomaniac. He had suffered megalomania. You tell a man like that the Jews pray in that location for his destruction, he became inflamed, livid. He will destroy them with a vengeance. Okay? But this is the Sadducees. These are Jews. Because they were opposed to the Pharisees, and they said they will go for the jugular vein and destroy us. These are the Lamalshinim. These are the informers. So what happened? So the Talmud tells a story. Shimon HaTzadik was going to preempt this destruction, and he and his priestly vestments, with all the other Kohanim, they went out with torches early in the morning, pre-dawn, and they marched from Yerushalayim straight into Alexander's camp. Alexander's surrounded by all his generals, and they're all geared to go that day to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. And Alexander is riding on his horse, and this is a man of war, and he sees Shimon HaTzadik. He sees Simon the Pious. The moment he sees him in his vestly garments, he immediately, priestly garments, he dismounts from his horse, and his generals are all around him on their horses. And he prostrates himself in front of Shimon HaTzadik, and he kisses the hem of his robes. Could you imagine? This they never ever saw. Alexander submits to no one, and to a Jew. And at this level, they said, something doesn't make sense here. As Alexander lost his mind, and he didn't lose his mind. So he goes, explains to his generals, I want to explain you something. Every battle that we've ever gone into, I have a dream before the battle. And who do I see in the dream? I see this rabbi. He appears to me in every dream. And when I see him in those white vestments, in his priestly garments, and I see his holy face, I know that means victory. And we're always victorious because of that man. So now we have this group of Jews who go and inform on his people, because he represented the Pharisees, that he praised for my destruction. This is the most extreme level of slander. They will pay the price. These Sadducees are going to pay the price. He gathered them together and he tied them to chariots. And he had the chariots, and he tied their hands and feet, dragged them across the countryside until they were totally obliterated. That's the punishment. But you see to what extent the Sadducees, being opposed to the position of the Jews, they will go to no length to destroy the Jewish people, even though they're Jews. But these are the informers. At that time, because of the seriousness of the moment, that they saw what this hate could bring to, they legislated and authored an additional bracha for the Amida. For the Malshin Malti Sikvor. The informers, there should be no hope for them. They should always be in a hopeless state. Risha, and all the evil, Kerega Toved. In a moment, it should be totally obliterated, destroyed. And all your enemies, Meri Koresu. Speedily, they should be cut down without a hesitation. So anything which represents evil, anything which represents the enemy, which is the evil, should be cut down, should be destroyed. We find that Moshe Rabbeinu, before he passed away, he was told to summon 1,000 people of each tribe and go to war against Midian. And Hashem says to Moshe, and you should avenge the vengeance of the Jewish people against the Midianites for what they did. The story with the Baal Peor, where they were seduced and there was a plague, and so many Jews, thousands of Jews died in the plague. Galvanize, assemble 12,000 men, 1,000 each tribe, and you go to war against the Midianites to avenge the vengeance of the Jewish people. Okay? Moshe Rabbeinu goes, assembles the leaders and says, I was told by God, we must go to war and gather the troops to avenge the vengeance of God. God said to Moshe, the vengeance of the Jewish people. And Hashem says, and Moshe says, to avenge the vengeance of God. So Hashem says to Moshe, if I've told you to avenge the vengeance of the Jewish people, what are you telling them to avenge the vengeance of God? You're not carrying out the order as you were instructed. So Moshe says to Hashem, since Sinai, that we were taken as your people, we've only had issues with the nations of the world. That magnified anti-Semitism. Why? Is it because it's us? Is it because we represent you? So although you said you should avenge the vengeance of the Jewish people, but where the problem is rooted in is not the Jewish people. It's rooted in our relationship with you, because we represent you, and because they're contrary and anti, whatever that is, that's the reason why they're our enemies. So in essence, they're your enemies. It only manifests itself that we are the brunt of their hate because we represent you. Therefore, Moshe says, therefore I said to the Jewish people, it's not avenging your vengeance, but it's God's vengeance. Because when you avenge the honor of God, then you're avenging yourselves, because you are only his representation in existence. That's what Moshe says to Hashem. So in this blessing that we say the informers should have no hope, meaning they should not succeed. And all evil in a moment should be consumed, should be obliterated. And all your enemies, maybe quickly should be cut off, cut down. Meaning, rather than seeing it as our problem, we clearly recognize it's not our problem, it's God's problem. Because we're attached to him, therefore, everybody has their axe to grind against us, but in truth, it's God, it's not us. We're only the victim because we represent him. So therefore, we ask Hashem, we supplicate him to destroy our enemies. We say, Kol oyivecho, possessive, all your enemies should be destroyed. They're not our enemies, they're your enemies. And therefore, our request is they should be destroyed because they've been informing on us. They represent evil, which is the antithesis of what God is. Everything is against the will of God. And all the enemies should be cut down, speedily cut down. So the Gemara asks, we had mentioned, why initially did they choose the number 18 to be the number for the Amidah, for the supplication? So one of the reasons given the Gemara is because in the vertebrae, in the spinal column, there are 18 vertebrae. And when you say the Amidah, it's an act of submission. You're submitting to God. If the spinal column would be made of one continuous piece of bone, you can never bend. You bend at the waist, but you can't bend your spine. You can only bend your spine because the spine is made up of vertebrae. Separate pieces of bone, which the spinal cord runs through the channel within those bones. So when we say we say all your enemies. So your enemies now, so if they're 18, they have to come up with some illusion, because if bending the spinal column represents submission, so 8, you have to submit within the context of 18 blessings. Now we have a 19th blessing. What corresponds to that 19th blessing? So the Talmud says that at the bottom of the spinal column, after the larger vertebrae, there's a tiny vertebrae on the bottom. That small vertebrae corresponds to that additional bracha. So it's no longer 18, it's 19. The 19 blessings in the Amidah for that reason. And the indication that we have a right to add that 18th, that the true concern is because that small vertebrae indicates there's a 19th. There's 19th level of supplication we need to be able to counter what they were for that reason. All evil should be destroyed. Kirega. What's a rega? What is the time frame of rega? So the Gemara tells us, the Gemara tells us in one location that Bilam, when he wanted to curse the Jews, he was waiting for the moment that God's wrath comes out on the world. Because since God's wrath is on the world, at that moment, that's when he'll slip in the curse. Because at that moment, there's no tolerance, anything unless it's absolutely pure. So that's what he thought. So the Gemara says, when God does become angry, how long does he become angry for? What's the length of time? What's the time frame? So the Gemara says, rega. It's for a rega. And the Gemara asks, how long is a rega? The modern Hebrew rega is a minute. But in the Talmud, when it says kirega, what is rega? God's wrath is much as a rega. So the Gemara answers, rega kamemra. The extent of rega is as long as it takes to say the word rega. It's a 3-letter word, so it's the equivalent of 3 letters. That's the extent of God's wrath every day. But if you'd actually catch it at that point where he's inflamed, it's an inferno, then chas v'shalom, the curse could be at a level which is unforgivable and not reconcilable, and the person doesn't achieve atonement. Okay? We say, kirega toved. What is a rega? Does it say tovdu? Kirega. What's a rega? As long as it takes to say rega. It means a moment. In one moment, they should be gone. Vasedim. Oyevecha are the enemies. These are non-Jews. Who are the Zaydim? Zaydim are people who are Jews, they're deprecators, they are opposed to anything that's spiritual, and they're out to destroy God's, so-called God's vineyard. For whatever reason, in their own warped minds, they go and they see it, it's a detriment to them, and therefore they inform on us. And they do many things. So we're asking Hashem, not only should he destroy, cut down the enemies who are your enemies, even the Zaydim, the Jews who identify as Jews, but it's only on their terms. Mehero Taker Shaber, quickly, Taker should uproot, you should smash, Smager means you should pulverize, Vesachnia, and you should humble. B'mehero b'yameinu. Speedily, with love in our time. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God. All blessing comes from you. The one who smashes the enemies and he subdues the Zaydim, the deprecators. So although we are the victims of anti-Semitism and all the enemies of Israel, we are, but in truth, it's Oyevecha. It's your God, it's your enemies. We being your people, we are victimized because you are our king. Therefore, it's quickly they should be cut down. You know, in Hebrew, the word for patience is savlanus. Why is it savlanus in Hebrew? Because in Hebrew, the word to suffer is sovel. Sovel means suffering. To be able to have patience, to put up with someone else, it's not easy. There's a degree of suffering. Except we're conditioned, you condition yourself to have patience with someone else. That's called patience. But in reality, it's savlunut. It's suffering. We say our enemies should immediately be cut down with immediacy. Because since they're your enemies, as long as they live, what did they represent? They are a counterforce against God, not against us. We are only the pawns on the board. They themselves are the ones who are opposed to God himself. Therefore, although that's what we say, but it's very strong words. Therefore, we say mehero. Immediately, they should be taken out. Don't give them a chance, because the longer they linger, the longer we experience and we are exposed to the Chil Hashem. So we say, in terms of the enemies, they should be cut down quickly. Zaydim are Jews. Zaydim, these are the deprecators, the ones who are arrogant and have no consideration other than themselves. Mehera taker, quickly, speedily, you should uproot. Seshaber, you should smash. Smager means you should cause to dissolve. The Sachnia, and they should be subservient. With God's help. Baruch to Hashem, blessed are you, God, meaning all blessing emanates from you. Shover Yivim, he breaks the enemy. And he subdues the heretics. We're talking about Jews. Machnia. Enemies who are the nations of the world, he destroys them. The Jew who's uninformed and he behaves unacceptably, he's Machnia Zaydim. He somehow calms that person who wants to deprecate everyone, who wants to bite everyone. That's Machnia Zaydim. There's a word, they used to say, there's no fight like a family fight. Many years ago, there's a person we all know, he was building a house in the Hamptons. Very elaborate, magnificent home. And people lived in the Hamptons, in his area, they're opposed to it. And they came up with all kinds of claims, it was all slander. That he's building a yeshiva there, that he has a 200-car garage, and he's going to overpopulate the area. Many things they said. And he wasn't authorized to build what he built. So there was a town attorney calls up these people, and he has a hearing with them. And they have all the reasons why this is illegal. What he did was illegal, this person, in the Hamptons. So the court, the town clerk takes out the papers. He says, whatever they did, they're permitted to do. It's on record. They were authorized to do whatever level of the construction as is seen, and they met all the criteria of the contract. They didn't breach the contract. That's what he tells him. This is a story. So and they still were coming after him. It's not right. So he was an Italian, this person, and he says to them, it seems to be a little bit of anti-Semitism. This is the non-Jew saying to these Jews, it seems to be slightly anti-Semitic the way people are talking. You don't want that kind of Jew in your neighborhood. See, they said to him, don't mix in our business. This is between us. You're not part of the clan, don't mix in. That's what he told his town supervisor. You understand? So who are the Zaydim? The trouble comes from the Jew, not from the Gentile, very often. But the enemy cut down immediately. The Jew, who is this deprecator, who has no tolerance for anything of Judaism, and therefore he informs, quickly uproot them, smash them, dissolve them, and tzachni, and humble them. B'meheira of Yemenu, quickly in our time. Baruch atah Hashem. Blessed are you, Hashem. All blessing comes from you. Shever oyevim, you smash the enemies. Umachne zedim, and you subdue the zedim, the deprecators. We're going to stop here to be continued on Sunday.